So what I want to do is, typically, as I mentioned earlier, a Roman Catholic will try to prove the antiquity of relic veneration by showing that a long time ago people respected the bodies of the dead. And you're going to have to do a lot better than that if you're going to convince me that relic veneration goes back to the age of the apostles and earlier. What's missing in the early evidence is people, the priests incensing, or there being any priests who are incensing relics, burning candles before relics, kissing relics, bowing down to relics, and kneeling to relics. And I want to just read the historical evidence that shows that just those things alone are novelties. Let's just first start with incense. I was reading the story of a journalist named Walid Shubat, and it's something people can look him up online. But he talked about how he converted to Roman Catholicism because he did some research and found that the earliest churches from the first century were using incense, which is what Roman Catholics do today. But he must not have done enough research, because even the Catholic Encyclopedia admits they find no evidence of the use of incense until the 5th century. This is the entry on incense. It says, when exactly incense was introduced into the religious services of the church is not easy to say. During the first 4 centuries, there's no evidence for its use. The liturgies of Saints James and Mark, which in their present form are not older than the 5th century, refer to its use at the sacred mysteries. So that's the Catholic Encyclopedia saying we can't find any evidence of anybody using incense in the first 4 centuries of Christianity. So we can rule out that the early church was incensing relics. They weren't venerating relics by incensing them. So let's go to burning candles. Lactantius, and we've talked about Lactantius before, good guy who lived, I think he lived before the Council of Nicaea, and I think died the year of the Council of Nicaea. And in his Divine Institutes, Book 6, Chapter 2, he ridicules the Romans who burn candles to their gods and says, we have no need to do that, for our God does not need candles. He says,
Uh-oh.
God has no need of their candles, who has himself given so clear and bright a light for the use of man. Is that man therefore to be thought in his senses, who presents the light of candles and torches as an offering to him who is the author and giver of light? So the light he requires from us is of another kind, and that indeed not accompanied by smoke. I mean the light of the mind. So so in one stroke, Lactantius rules out incense and candles, saying, hey, and you don't find evidence of incense and candles being used in Christian worship until you get to the latter part of the 4th century. And we have Jerome in his letter to Marcella in 385 AD talking about he had been given a gift of wax candles, and he says that reminds us that we should look for the bridegroom's coming with our lights burning. And then in 396 or later, he was criticized. There was a man named Vigilantius who had criticized the use of wax candles to honor the martyrs, and Jerome defended that. So his defense of that was in 404 AD, but the criticism of it was from about 396 AD. So here we have so we can rule out candles and incense, right? Well, let's the first recorded instance of kissing a relic is from a letter 46 from Jerome in 386 AD, and he says, everywhere we venerate the tombs of the martyrs. We apply their holy ashes to our eyes. We even touch them, if we may, with our lips. Then we shall touch with our lips the wood of the cross and rise in prayer. And so here, this is a letter from the latter part of the 4th century showing that they were venerating the relics of martyrs by kissing them, and also venerating the wood of the cross by kneeling before it and kissing it. But again, this is the first recorded instance. So we have kissing relics we don't find until the latter part of the 4th century. Incense we can't even find to the 5th. Wax candles we don't find used in Christian worship or to honor martyrs until you get to the latter part of the 4th century. And then the first recorded evidence we have for bowing to relics is Cyril of Alexandria, and he lived from 376 to 444 AD. And this is the first case we have of a description of bowing down to the relics. He says, "We by no means consider the holy martyrs to be gods, nor are we wont to bow down before them adoringly, but only relatively and reverentially." So he's saying, yes, we do bow down to them, but we're only bowing down to them with reverence. And that's, let's just be clear here. You're not supposed to bow down to anything.
Yeah, right.
The commandment from the Lord is not, don't bow down to something unless you're just showing some relative respect. He says, don't bow down to images at all. And here you have the latter part of the 4th century and early part of the 5th is they're bowing down to relics. And you remember what we said earlier about how in the high mass the relic is placed on the altar and incensed.
Yeah, they get 2 swings, right?
And in one of these, one of the examples we gave, people would kneel before the relic that's exposed on the altar. Well, if you read the Council of Nicaea, Canon 20, this is from 325 AD, it says that kneeling was forbidden on Sundays and on Sundays all year, and every day from Passover to Pentecost at the Council of Nicaea. Now that's interesting because here you have, if there was a day for Christians to get together and venerate a relic by kneeling to it, it would typically be on a Sunday when the priest is supposed to be conducting the sacrifice of the Mass and exposing the relics on the altar for people to venerate, right? I mean, this is what Roman Catholics want us to believe was happening in the early church, and yet the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the church, Canon 20, forbids kneeling on Sundays. So how can you possibly say that kneeling before relics, bowing to relics, kissing relics, burning incense and candles before relics is apostolic when all the evidence we have is that those practices were either forbidden in the early church, or we just simply can't find any evidence that it was ever adopted until the latter part of the 4th century. And it's I think it's fascinating to hear the Roman Catholic Encyclopedia say, hey, this is one of the few where we have evidence for it. And yet the very means that they would prescribe for venerating relic were things that you just can't find any proof for. In fact, sometimes were explicitly forbidden in the early church. So one thing we can say is that as we go through the history of relics, we're going to look at them and say, it's not enough to show that the Israelites carried the body of Joseph back to Hebron. You're going to have to show that they burned incense and candles to it and bowed and kneeled and kissed it. You just don't find that. So what we'll do next, now that we can rule out the means of veneration, because even the Roman Catholic Encyclopedia acknowledges they just can't find evidence for doing that. We're going to move on to the actual treatment of dead bodies, going all the way back to Jacob and Joseph's bones in the Old Testament. But do you see? Do you understand where we're going, though? Is that if you can't find evidence of incense in the early church, and you do find the prohibition of kneeling on Sundays, you can be guaranteed that they were not offering incense and kneeling before relics in the Sunday worship service in the early church. This is a novelty from the latter part of the 4th century. It's not apostolic at all.
Yeah, and who was it that you said, was it Lactantius? You even identified that some of that was pagan worship. So,
yes, exactly.
I mean,
In fact, when the Vigilantius, who objected to the veneration of relics in the latter part of the 4th century, said that you're just importing pagan practices into the church. This is how the people who were believers back then, who rejected the kneeling before images and the kneeling before burning candles before martyrs and kneeling before and kissing their relics, they recognized that something was happening and pagan practices were being imported into the church. And a lot of these pagan practices were imported in the latter part of the 4th century. So,
yeah, no, I'm with you.